Everything you have been told about screens at the dinner table frames the story as a simple battle between technology and family connection. The real story is far more complicated, more human, and more honest than that familiar argument ever manages to be. Screens at the table arrived because families were exhausted, schedules were fractured, and personalized entertainment solved real problems that real people faced every single evening. The question is not whether technology belongs at the table, it is what quietly disappeared when attention stopped being something families chose to share. Picture a family of 4 sitting down together at the end of a long and genuinely difficult day, close enough to pass the salt. One is watching a video. One is answering a message that really cannot wait until morning. The youngest is laughing at something nobody else can see, and the oldest is somewhere else entirely, earbuds in, unreachable. They are all present in the room, and none of them are there. That feeling, familiar, low-grade, hard to name, is what this film is trying to understand. Before the first screen arrived at the table, the meal itself was the technology, the daily mechanism families used to stay inside each other's lives. It wasn't just food being passed. It was the small reports that kept people legible to one another. The "How was your day?" that actually got answered. A child learned how adults talked through problems by watching it happen in real time, right across the salt shaker. A parent learned which friend had become important, which teacher was unfair, which small worry had grown into something that needed attention. The ritual held information that no single conversation could carry on its own, because it repeated every evening at the same table with the same people. Anthropologists call it a phatic exchange, meaning talk whose purpose is connection itself, not the content of the words. What got built over hundreds of those ordinary dinners was something closer to a shared language, a family's private shorthand for love, conflict, and belonging. So, when that structure began to quietly change, what was lost wasn't just conversation. It was the daily practice of knowing each other. The television didn't arrive at the dinner table as an intruder. It arrived as a guest that nobody thought to ask to leave. Families in the 1950s and 60s pulled their chairs toward the set, balancing plates on their laps because the picture felt like company. Manufacturers even sold furniture for it. The TV tray, a small folding table designed to make eating in front of the screen feel domestic and normal. What had been a ritual of conversation became a ritual of watching, and most families made that trade without noticing the exchange. The dialogue that once moved around the table now moved in one direction only, from the screen, toward everyone, answered by no one. Research from those decades found that households with a television in the kitchen reported fewer words spoken at meals, not because families were unhappy, but because the screen had simply claimed the silence. And silence, it turns out, is where conversation begins. So when the next wave of screens arrived, smaller, personal, and impossible to share, the table had already been quietly rehearsing for it. The television, at least, was shared. Everyone at the table looked at the same thing. That shared screen, however passive, still gave a family a common reference point, something to react to together. Then the smartphone arrived, and then the tablet, and then the personal streaming account with its perfectly curated recommendations. Suddenly, every person at the table had their own private window into a world built specifically for them. Your daughter's feed showed her friends. Your son's showed game highlights. Your own phone held the work thread you'd been ignoring for an hour. The table was still full of people, but each person's attention had been claimed, quietly, completely, by something designed to hold it. No single moment caused this shift. It accumulated, one notification at a time, one earphone at a time. What the television had done to the dinner table was manageable, because at least the distraction was collective. So why did families accept this new arrangement so easily? And what did it cost them before anyone noticed?
Nobody handed a phone to a 6-year-old at dinner because they stopped caring about family connection. They did it because dinner was at 7, and the 6-year-old had been melting down since 5:30. You know that particular exhaustion, the kind that doesn't ask for much, just 12 quiet minutes to finish a meal while it's still warm. Work didn't stop when the table was set, because work doesn't stop anymore, and a message left unanswered felt like a risk nobody could afford. Different schedules meant different hunger, different moods, and a teenager who'd already eaten wasn't going to sit in cheerful silence out of principle. The screen was a pressure valve, and in the moment, it worked. Crying stopped, the argument didn't start, the email got sent. These weren't failures of love or intention. They were practical solutions to real, daily friction. The logic was sound, the relief was genuine, and the habit formed before anyone thought to question what it was quietly replacing. Nobody mourns the conversation that never quite happened. The offhand joke that got swallowed by a notification. The story a kid started and then quietly abandoned when nobody looked up. What screens take from the family meal isn't the big moments, the announcements, the arguments that clear the air. It's the small, low-stakes, forgettable ones that turn out to be the texture of a family's life together. The question your daughter asked about whether fish feel cold. The impression your son did of his teacher that made everyone laugh too hard. Those moments don't announce themselves as important. They arrive in the gaps, in the silence between bites, in the boredom that nobody has filled yet. And when a screen fills that gap first, the moment doesn't fight for space. It just doesn't happen. Research on family conversation finds that screen-present meals produce fewer exchanges, shorter responses, and less laughter. Not conflict, just absence. You can sit at the same table every night and still slowly become strangers to the version of each other that only shows up when there's nothing else competing for your attention. It usually isn't a fight that makes a family notice something has changed. It's a silence that feels different from the comfortable kind. Someone looks up from their phone and realizes no one at the table is looking at anyone else. And for a second, that lands. The realization doesn't arrive as an argument or a breakdown. It arrives as a small, quiet sting. Maybe it's a parent who asks how school was and gets a one-word answer from a child whose eyes never leave a screen. Maybe it's a partner who finishes an entire meal without once making eye contact, not out of anger, but out of habit. What stings most isn't the distraction itself. It's the recognition that this has become normal. You can't remember when it shifted, only that it did, and that the table used to feel like something it no longer quite feels like. That moment of noticing is uncomfortable, but it's also the first honest thing that happens in a long time. Researchers who study family meals tend to find something consistent, even if the explanations remain contested. Families who eat together regularly, with fewer interruptions, report stronger communication and a clearer sense of connection over time. That pattern holds across many studies, but correlation is not causation, and it's worth holding that distinction carefully. What the research cannot cleanly separate is whether shared meals build connection, or whether already connected families are simply more likely to protect them. What observation does suggest more confidently is that divided attention changes the quality of conversation in the room. When a screen pulls someone's focus mid-sentence, the other person registers it, not always consciously, but the rhythm of the exchange shifts. Children in particular seem sensitive to whether they have a parent's full attention or only a portion of it. The effect isn't catastrophic in a single meal, but researchers note it accumulates.
And what remains genuinely uncertain is how much of this is about screens specifically versus distraction in any form. That question matters because it changes what a family actually needs to do.
The family dinner that anchors this conversation already carries a particular shape. A table, a set hour, everyone seated at once. But that picture belongs to a specific kind of household, and not every family lives inside it. A shift worker coming home at 9 doesn't share a meal at 6, no matter how much she wants to. A single parent feeding 3 kids between homework and bedtime isn't managing a ritual. She's managing a rescue operation. Immigrant families often bring meal cultures where screens and noise and overlapping conversations have always coexisted without anyone feeling disconnected. Multi-generational households run on rhythms that don't resolve into one clean, shared moment. So when we ask whether screens are pulling families apart at the table, we have to ask, which table and whose? The concern is real, but it doesn't land the same way in every kitchen. What changes the picture isn't the screen itself, it's the context surrounding it. And nowhere does that context become more visible than when families step outside the home entirely. Something shifts when a family carries its habits into a restaurant and suddenly other people can see them. The server approaches the table and waits while a parent finishes a work message, while a child scrolls without looking up, while the silence between them fills with notification sounds instead of conversation. You've probably seen this from across a dining room. Maybe you've been this table without realizing it. There's a particular kind of visibility in a public space that the kitchen doesn't offer, because strangers become an accidental mirror. The family that looks connected at home, each person in their own corner, looks different at a restaurant, isolated, even a little lost, despite sitting close enough to share a breadbasket. What the restaurant reveals isn't a failure of love. It's the shape of a habit made visible under new light. The server comes back a second time, and a third, and nobody has looked at the menu because nobody has looked at each other. That moment, that small, ordinary stall, is the habit asking to be noticed. Most families don't decide to change because of a study or a documentary. They decide because of a moment. A child answers a question without looking up, or a partner finishes a meal and can't remember what was said. That moment lands differently than any statistic ever could, and it's usually what sends someone to the internet searching for a solution. What they find looks simple. Put the phones in a basket, make a rule, and dinner becomes conversation again. What actually happens is messier, more human, and honestly more interesting than that. The first few nights without screens often feel like withdrawal. Not dramatic, just awkward. A silence that nobody knows how to fill. Teenagers who've never had to perform dinner table conversation suddenly realize they don't know how. Parents who pushed for the change find themselves reaching for their own phones out of pure habit. The negotiation that follows, about exceptions, about work messages, about what counts as an emergency, is where most families actually live. And that negotiation isn't failure. It's the real work of deciding what you value when the default is gone. Most families who find their way back to the table don't do it through a single dramatic decision. They do it through small, repeated choices that lower the cost of showing up without a screen. Some families designate one meal a week as the one where phones stay in another room. Not every meal, just one. Others keep devices visible, but agree on a simple rule. If it buzzes, it waits until everyone has finished eating. A few families introduce what researchers call a talking piece. One question written on a card, passed around, answered by everyone before the meal ends. What's surprising isn't that these approaches work. It's that they work even when they're inconsistent. Even when teenagers roll their eyes,
even when a parent checks their phone anyway. The goal was never a perfect table. The goal was a table where attention gets chosen, at least sometimes, on purpose. And that small shift, from accidental distraction to deliberate presence, is where something real begins to grow.
Ask a teenager what they want from dinner, and they'll probably shrug, maybe reach for their phone before the question even lands. But when researchers ask them in private, away from the table, a different answer surfaces. Most of them want to be talked to, not at. They want the adults in their lives to be curious about them, genuinely curious, not running through a checklist of school and homework and weekend plans. What they describe, without always naming it, is the feeling of being seen by someone who isn't distracted. And here's what makes that complicated. Many of those same teenagers are the ones bringing screens to the table, filling silence with a feed, because silence with people you love can feel surprisingly exposed. Younger children read the room differently. They notice when a parent's eyes drift to a notification, and they adjust quietly, without complaint. They learn what the table is for by watching what the adults around them actually do. That gap between what children want and what the table currently offers them is worth sitting with. Because it's the same gap adults feel, and nobody in the family invented it alone. A single distracted dinner doesn't leave a mark, but 1,000 of them quietly write the family's story. What accumulates isn't damage in any dramatic sense. It's a slow narrowing of the conversational range families feel comfortable sharing. The topics that never came up at dinner don't vanish. They just find no natural home. And children learn which parts of themselves belong at the table. Over years, that shapes something harder to name than a wound. It shapes the texture of shared memory, the sense of what your family actually talks about, and who you are together. Research on family narrative, the stories families tell about themselves, consistently links shared mealtime conversation to how strongly children feel they belong to something larger than themselves. Without those repeated, ordinary exchanges, the family's internal story gets thinner. Not broken, but thinner. And the question worth sitting with is whether the version of your family that exists in 10 years reflects the one you'd actually choose. The answer to that question isn't fixed yet, and that matters more than any single meal ever could. Nobody is asking you to throw the phones in a drawer and pretend it's 1987. The path back to the table doesn't begin with a rule. It begins with a single, deliberate choice to be present for one meal with the people sitting right in front of you. That choice doesn't have to be perfect, and it won't be, because families are not perfect and neither is attention. What research consistently shows is that frequency matters more than duration. Even 15 minutes of genuine, undivided conversation carries more weight than an hour of shared silence. The question isn't whether screens belong in your life, because they do. The question is whether they belong at every table, at every meal, without anyone ever deciding that consciously. Small shifts accumulate the same way the drift did. One meal, one habit, one honest conversation at a time. And the families who find their way back don't usually announce it. They just notice, one quiet evening, that everyone is talking again. The table has always been more than a place to eat. It's where we first learn that other people exist. Every family that puts the phone down, even once, is practicing something older than any technology we've ever built. It doesn't take a perfect meal or a perfect family to feel the difference between being near someone and being with someone. The moments that hold us together are almost always small, almost always ordinary, and almost always chosen. You don't have to get it right every time. You only have to keep choosing
to try. Choosing to try. Connection isn't something that happens, it's something we make deliberately at a table with the people who matter most. Human Operating System. Hos Documentary.